Hello everybody, my name's Anne Cooper. I'm a registered nurse who happens to specialise in informatics. I sort of feel like I've got the bit of the graveyard slot really, where I'm following Gareth talking about being digital ready, which feels slightly ironic because I am definitely not as digitally ready as Gareth happens to be. First of all, I want to tell you about something that's going on across the 4 countries in collaboration with the RCN and myself, which is a consultation with you all about how we are doing around the technology agenda in nursing. And I wish I'd put it on my slide, but I'm going to tell you about a website which I'll tweet after I've finished as well, which is www.rcn.clevertogether.com. And if you get a chance, have a look at it and please participate. And I had hoped that I would tell you about some of the things that we were finding on that particular consultation, but the consultation is still open, so it's not ready to start telling you about our findings there yet, but I'm sure you'll find some really interesting things on there. So I'm going to talk about digital readiness, but from a very personal perspective. And I'm hoping that you're not expecting a technical presentation, because that's not going to happen. I am not particularly technical. And I'm going to talk about why I think digital readiness is about something else. I think digital readiness is about people, and it's about professionalism. So there's 2 strands that I've picked up from earlier today. And I think some of the things that I'll talk about in terms of digital readiness, you might see as some of the themes that Charlotte talked about this morning. And if you think about some of the things that I'm going to say about digital readiness and compare them to some of the things that Gareth's been showing us and how Gareth has dealt with his technology challenges, you'll see some connections there too. Those pictures on the screen are me on the right in 1983 as a second-year student nurse, and on the left in about 1989 as a ward sister. And back then, there wasn't this thing called technology or technical readiness in any respect at all, really. I think syringe driver pumps was probably the nearest thing that we were starting to see emerging. We were still taking blood pressure on spigs. We were still using a thermometer that was a thermometer. Lots of things that we accept and see now as part of the way we practice, particularly in the acute setting. I was an acute nurse, are commonplace technology that you will all recognise and see now. So actually, I think as a profession or professions, we are actually quite adept at change and adapting things and building them into practice. And I don't really understand as a consequence why we see the technical challenge as being something that's different, that we need to do differently. We've been doing this and blending these things into practice for many, many decades. I think midwives are a really good example of how we adopt technology in practice. But also, we do it in our personal lives. So I'm going to ask you to do something for me, ask you to do something physical. So everybody in the room, put your hands up. Put your hand down, or both hands down, if you do digital banking. Online banking. Put your hands down if you've ever ordered anything on the internet. Okay, so you're all digitally ready. You are absolutely digitally ready. Because if you can do either of those 2 things, then you can use technology in your personal lives, and that's what this is about. So like you, over those decades from back then where there was nothing, I've assimilated that technology into my life and into my practice. I also have a long-term condition. I also have type 1 diabetes, and if it bleeps, I've got an insulin pump, which is another form of assistive technology, really. So again, in my personal life, from a clinical perspective, I've assimilated technology into the way that I live. I've also got a continuous glucose monitor on, which is vital alarm, because it's like a bit of a nag at the moment. So I didn't get any training in any of those things to speak of. I had a little bit of training on my pump, but nobody ever showed me how to do internet banking. Nobody ever showed me how to order things on Amazon, but I'm pretty good at that. So I actually think that sometimes we mystify this agenda in a way that we really don't need to, because the interfaces and things that we use now are improving dramatically. So if I think then I'm digitally ready, I'm going to talk to you about 5 characteristics that I think that make me so. What are the 5 things that I think are the most important things? And they're nothing to do with being able to code or use technology in a particular way, or even understand some of the things that the very technical people that I work with talk about. I work in organisations where clinicians are in the minority, and the technical people, and they're very, very clever, are in the majority. And it's not, I don't need to be like them, I just need to be a really good nurse who has these particular characteristics. And the first one is I think that we need to be change positive. And I think that's having a positive professional orientation towards change. And we've heard some of those things this morning about our readiness to embrace doing things differently for improvement. I've always done different things, and my career is littered with jobs that have been very different. I've always done jobs that nobody's done before. Since I was a ward sister, I've never had a job that literally somebody's done before me. So I've always had a very positive orientation towards change. I've done things like I was the first complaints manager in the trust that I worked in when we didn't have them. I set up one of the sites with a team, not just me. Obviously, I was part of a team that set up NHS Direct in England. And people told me that it wasn't possible to care for people by phone. They told me that I was destroying my career, that I shouldn't go and work there, because we were never going to work in that way. But actually, if you think about it, orientation towards using telephone-based care is a big shift that we've seen perhaps in the last 2 decades. I love experimentation, safely, of course, but I love trying to do things differently. So I loved Gareth's examples of how he'd sought solutions to some of the problems that he was facing. I'm experimenting with you today. I would have liked to have walked around the stage to do it, but I'm experimenting at the moment, presenting without slides, because I think it's good for us to try different things and to experiment in different ways. I think that all nurses need to be change ready. I think the days are gone when technology is going at such a pace that we can't afford to say, well, we've always done it like this, it's going to stay like this, because technology is emerging at such a pace that we won't be able to do that. And that's the world that you live in. It's no different in practice than it is in your everyday life. Things that I think are examples of that are really going to test us are things like genomics and personalised care. I foresee that in my lifetime, some of those things will fundamentally change the way that we practice. I've already seen significant professional changes on wards and things, and I've already talked about things like the way we do observations, the way we monitor patients. But there's many, many, many examples. I used to be a cardiothoracic surgical nurse, and I remember my favourite end. We had 2 ends to the ward. We had the heart end and the lung end, and at the lung end they were the more complex patients, and I loved working on that side of the ward, but we used to literally cut their chests up and to do lobectomies, whereas now those types of things are done by keyhole surgery, and that's in a very short career lifetime really. So think about all of the things that technology does to change the way we practice. Looking after somebody who has a massive chest incision versus somebody who's had a small incision is very, very different. All of these technologies impact on the way that we nurse. So my second characteristic, the first then was change positive. The second is curiosity. I think being curious is a really important part of what we should do. And again, Gareth exemplified that. So if I'm mentoring people who are aspirant leaders in nursing, I will tell them that curiosity is one of the key things that they need to be able to do. And sometimes that makes people feel uncomfortable. I've many a time asked difficult questions of people because I'm curious about what the future might hold or how things might work. But it's about being able to see a wider perspective. It's about being able to ask questions, what if type questions. What if we linked that to that? What if we adopted that technology in an elderly care setting? What if we put those devices in other homes where we could care differently? Curiosity is a really important factor of the way we view the future using technology. Data is the same. We should be asking lots of questions about data. We need to crack having nursing data in order that we can seek an understanding. So what am I currently curious about? I visited a brilliant care home near Coventry in England about 2 weeks ago. And it was really interesting. So I'm obviously more familiar with the acute setting. But in this care home, they had noise detectors in all of the rooms. And, we asked them lots of questions about how intrusive it was to have noise detectors, but of course they go through all of that with the families, with the residents. And what the noise detectors meant was they could detect any significant abnormal noise in a room at night, which meant that the carers didn't have to go and open doors and look into rooms at night time. So it restored privacy for lots of people. But what it did, therefore, was they couldn't reduce the number of people in the home because you need a certain number of people to be able to evacuate safely. But those staff were redirected, so they now have a wide awake club at night where people who don't sleep at night, who they tended to, in the past, try to get back into bed, they don't do that anymore. They take them to a safe place and they do positive activities with them. So technology can have a really positive effect on shifting what we do with our resources and what we do with our time. They're also experimenting with Alexa, and I guess that'll be an interesting thing for them to explore. So I think these things are really interesting seams of technology for us to be curious about, to ask questions about, and to think about how we could apply them in different ways to practice. So the third characteristic. I think nurses are quite good at this, but it's a technology trait too, and it's a relentless focus on improvement. I think that if we relentlessly focus on doing things better, actually, we are technology enabled, we're data enabled, because data is a key part of improvement methodology. I care deeply about the experience of people. It's driven partly by my profession, but it's also driven by my personal experiences of the care system. So I tend to have a very interesting and unique perspective. So I'm working in a technology space. I use data all the time. I use sort of a version of technology, which is my insulin pump. I've got software on the computer that I can analyze my data using. So I've got a really interesting, I think, perspective of all of this. And improvement is a really important activity. And sometimes I see it done well, and sometimes I see it done really badly. This week, I had a letter from my GP, and I opened the letter, and inside there was a letter that said, we noticed that on your prescription, you have pre-filled insulin pens, which I do, because they're a backup for the pump. So you have to have them in case your pump fails. But they'd interrogated the data, they'd obviously interrogated the system and identified all the patients who had pre-filled insulin pens but didn't have a prescription for the needles that attach to the pens. That all sounds pretty sensible, really. You know, you should be changing the pen needles very regularly after each time they're used. Now, I've got a box of around 300, I would think, needles at home. And the reason I don't use them, and the reason I rarely use the pre-filled pens, is because they're my backup. In fact, I don't think there's any wood here, so I'm hesitant to say this, but I've never actually had to use them in anger. Now, for me, that's a poor use of data. And that's what I mean by using data properly to relentlessly focus on improvement. Because to add insult to injury, they also sent me a leaflet to explain how to give a good injection. I use a pump, so I don't inject, but also, on top of that, I've had type 1 diabetes since 1979. In fact, I would suspect that I had type 1 diabetes for longer than the person who generated the letter in the practice. So being technology enabled is about using data properly, using it well with a relentless focus on improvement. I think we don't talk about data for improvement in nursing often enough. We don't talk about data quality. We don't talk about the importance of what we record. We don't talk about things like when I was at a ward sister, we used to, who in the room has ever written slept well in a nursing card? This will show your age. Put your hand up if you have. Yeah, I know. I have too. And the half-life of that particular piece of record keeping is probably very short because the likelihood of that being looked at back then when you wrote it again is quite small. Whereas now, when you record that type of information in electronic health records, it has the potential to be sustained in it and used in a different way. So we've got to get much smarter about using data. So a relentless focus on improvement using data is my third thing. My fourth thing, there's only 5, so I am getting there. My fourth thing is resilience. Now, resilience is quite a trendy word, I think, and we use it in many different ways to talk about the environment that we're operating in. If you look it up online, it talks about bounce back ability. And actually, what do I mean by resilience in this context? Well, learning to use technology and capitalising on its potential takes resilience because lots of times things will go wrong. But you have to just move past that. My suspicion is that Gareth had lots of attempts at things that didn't work, and that he kept going because he knew that actually he could find a solution. That's resilience. That's a technical sort of characteristic that's about keeping going. No matter how many times you try and it doesn't work, you've got to seek another way. It's being like water. And people who work in informatics quite often get a lot of doors shut in their faces too, because we are not currently, we're getting there. We're not really a very sexy part of the profession yet, but we're getting there. So it's a hard gig is working in informatics, so you've got to be really quite resilient. You've got to keep readjusting, reframing, redescribing it in ways that people can engage with and understand. It's okay to say as well, that didn't work. It's okay to say, that didn't work, but I'm going to try something else. That learning from when things don't work and recreating it and doing it again is what we need to do to be technology and digitally enabled. For 17 years I've been working in this sort of space now. It's a long time, and I was probably one of the first nurses who had a reasonably significant role in this sort of space. And for a long time I felt like I was talking to myself. It's only in the latter years that I've been invited to places like this to speak to you all. So that takes a degree of resilience too. So finally then, trait 5. I am very privileged these days. I am often asked to be a judge at awards and things, and it's a real privilege to be sat there hearing nurses, midwives, talk about the stories and things that they tell around things that they're proud of. But sometimes I get slightly exasperated because I've got this national role in England. I'm quite well connected with what's going on. And nurses will come in and tell me about something that they've done that was really, really good. And it is good. But I happen to know that it might have already been done in Northern Ireland, or it might have already been done in Yorkshire or in London or over the other side of the fence. And I think we can be quite insular. We don't capitalise on looking out as much as we could. So I think my final characteristic of being digitally enabled is networking and learning from each other. And some of you might have heard me speak before about social media. I think social media is a fantastic environment for us to do some of that work, and it is work. It's not just, I use Facebook for my personal stuff, so I don't do work on there, but when I'm on Twitter, I'm working. I'm networking, I'm connecting people, I'm looking for new ways of doing things. If you think about it, if we always looked to see if somebody else had done what we did, and we combined our ideas together, how we could build and do better and better and better. And if we use networks creatively and have that mindset to look around and see what other people are doing, I think that's being digitally enabled. Social media is one way of doing that. And of course, it's also created a new way of being across the world. It's not just about, in the past you might gather together in regional networks. Now we can look all over. In fact, again, Charlotte this morning was talking about how the professionalism work. I think she said he'd gone to Australia. She said Australia, didn't she? So how connected are you? What are your networks like? Are you really working your networks? Are you that digitally enabled? So I urge you to connect and look around. I urge you to find your passions and find the things that you are interested in progressing, and look around and use digital to enable you to do better. The other place that I would say to look, there are loads of examples of places where you can find good ideas. So who's heard of Fab NHS Stuff? Are they over in Northern Ireland? Has Terry ever been over there? Look them up. There is just a plethora of stuff on there. It's almost certain that you're going to find somebody else who's done something very similar to the work that you want to do. So then, and finally, and I'll be short, I'll be under, which will be good, you'll be pleased. Why do I think I might be digitally ready? So the 5 characteristics again. I'm change positive, curious, and relentlessly focused on improving the experience of service users and, importantly, outcomes. I'm resilient and prepared to try new things and learn from others. I'd like to think about those characteristics that I've talked about and compare those to the things that Charlotte talked about this morning and the things that are in your booklet about professionalism, and I'm sure you'll find some parallels. Are you digitally ready? And finally, I'll tweet when I go back down. We have to shoot off to get flights home, but I'll tweet the link to the sites and watch out for the outcome of the consultation. It's across the whole 4 countries, but we will try to make sure that we can give a countrywide perspective if we can do that. It would be fascinating if everybody in this room logged on, had a look, voted, and added their ideas about what digital ready was. We're asking 3 questions. The first question is, what does the vision of nursing for you look like where it's technically enabled? The second question is, what are the barriers and enablers that will help us to get there? And the third, and I know you have these in Northern Ireland, are what are the good examples that you know about already that illustrate us on that journey? So it would be really good if you could go onto the site. It's www.rcn.clevertogether.com. Thank you very much.
That you drew, between having lots and lots of data, but the challenge is what of it is information. I think sometimes you can be data rich and information poor because
Absolutely.
You don't know which bits are abuse. And I was reminded of when I used to work in district nursing, and I remember one winter, it's like out in the district, the snow and the back roads, and I went into British Home Stores looking for a pair of nice trendy Wellingtons, and I remember seeing this fabulous grey pair of and I remember being so obsessed with the dye number to make sure that they were both exactly the same shade of grey, and when I got them home they were a different size. So, sometimes you get too clued down in and miss the.
That's a really nice example, actually. She might use that again.
Any questions for Anne?
Sorry, Wendy Clark, I'm a lead midwife in the Southern Trust. I have just one question in relation to technology. The older staff in the areas and that are really resistant despite training to technology and the implementation of it, how do you bring them along?
It's a really interesting question because I don't really buy into the fact, so I'm 54, so I don't really buy into the idea that this is about age particularly. I've got a mum who uses a smartphone. She is also very good on Amazon. I've got a dad who's found email. I know lots of people who Skype. So I don't really buy into the age thing. But what I do buy into is that we perhaps don't make technology as good as it could be to make it as easy to use as Amazon and Facebook and those other environments. I think, unfortunately, health technology is by its nature quite complicated. If you think about how we display drugs and things, it's quite a risky thing to do. So we've got to get smarter at actually creating better technology. But that will only happen, guys, if you guys get in the room to do it. So that's what we need to do. We need to join with the technologists to create better technology that makes it easier for everybody to use, not just those people who might be resistant to using it. The other thing, most nurses who are fearful, it's usually fear-driven, think that they're going to wipe everything. It's really difficult to wipe everything. Really, really difficult. And one of the things that's on the site, actually, that people are talking about is using champions to share, to walk alongside people. But for me, fundamentally, it's better quality interfaces that make the technology much, much easier to use. And that's you guys. You need to get in the room with the technologists and tell them what you want.
Hello, Annie. Thank you very much. That's very inspirational. I'm Brenda Creaney. I'm Director of Nursing in the Belfast Trust. And we've just recruited our first informatics nurse, Anne-Marie. She's very shy.
Hello, Anne-Marie.
And I was really pleased with what you said about not being technical, because I do believe as nurses we need to grasp this and grow our own. I also agree with you that it isn't an age thing. But certainly having any technology thrust upon us, we will not embrace it. It's not how we're built. So we need to say what works and what doesn't. And I know when I speak to my IT colleagues, they are begging for us to do that. It's a very open door.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, so thank you.
In response to that, I would say well done. I think you've made a critical strategic decision to have somebody. That's brilliant. I'd say you're absolutely right. This is not about being... forgive me for this language, a geeky nurse. It's not about that. It's about being a leader. It's about being prepared to stand up for what's right. It's about being prepared to do battle with other professional colleagues and your own colleagues to get them to the table, to get the right outcome. And I'm very, very happy to connect you to lots of nurses who are doing very similar work in the UK. There's a network of people in the UK on the other side of the water who are doing this sort of work, so it would be great for you to connect.
Oh, we'd be really grateful for that. Thank you, Annie.
I'll tweet and you'll be able to get hold of me on Twitter. I'm Annie Coops on Twitter.
Okay, thank you very much.